All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're tackling what a lot of scholars consider one of the most fascinating puzzles in ancient history. And just a heads up, this isn't a theological debate. Instead, we're putting on our detective hats to investigate a specific historical claim and the evidence around it. So, right off the bat, you can see how high the stakes are. This quote claims that one single event is the absolute linchpin of an entire world faith. This isn't just some minor detail. It's presented as the bedrock, the entire foundation. And that's our guiding question for this whole explainer. What exactly is this event? And how is it possible that, 2,000 years later, it's still called a mystery? We're going to break down the core claim, and then we're going to investigate the most common alternative explanations. Okay, first things first, we need to be crystal clear about what we're actually looking at. This entire puzzle boils down to one very specific and pretty extraordinary claim that was made back in the first century. And there it is. This is the three-part claim that's at the heart of our investigation. A man was executed, he was confirmed dead, and then, according to his followers, he was seen alive again. So our job is to examine this like a historical case, looking at the arguments for and against it. Any good investigation starts with what you actually know for sure. So before we get into the really controversial parts, let's establish some common ground. Facts that a wide range of historians, even the really skeptical ones, tend to accept. It really comes down to these two foundational points we're going to build on. First, that Jesus died by crucifixion. And second, that almost immediately after, his followers started claiming they saw him alive. Let's tackle that first point. Now, you might have heard of something called the swoon theory, the idea that maybe Jesus didn't really die on the cross, he just sort of passed out. But most historians just don't buy that. Why? Well, to put it bluntly, the Romans were brutally efficient experts at execution. The idea that someone could survive crucifixion and then somehow escape a guarded tomb is just seen as extremely unlikely. Okay, so if we operate on the assumption that Jesus really did die, how on earth do you account for his followers suddenly claiming they saw him alive and well? This is where the mystery really kicks into high gear. We're going to walk through the three most common alternative explanations. All right, explanation number one, they lied. Simple as that. This theory suggests the disciples, for whatever reason, snuck in, stole the body, and just made the whole story up from scratch. A classic conspiracy, right? But here's where that theory hits a major psychological snag. Think about it. People will absolutely die for something they believe is true. But how many people do you know who would willingly face persecution, prison, and a horrible death for a story they know they just made up? It's a pretty big hurdle for this theory. So let's move on to the next possibility. What if they weren't lying, but they were just profoundly mistaken? This is the hallucination theory. It proposes that the disciples were so overcome with grief and trauma that their minds basically invented these visions. They sincerely believed they saw Jesus, but it was all in their heads. And this gets to the main challenge for the hallucination theory. If you talk to psychologists, they'll tell you that hallucinations are, by their very nature, private, individual events. What's happening in my head can't be seen by you. Yet, the claim here wasn't just about one person having a vision. It was about groups of people all claiming to see the same thing at the same time. And that brings us to this number, 500. One of the earliest accounts we have, written by the Apostle Paul, cites a tradition that Jesus appeared to over 500 people at one time. Now, the idea of 500 different people all having the exact same complex hallucination at the same moment, well, critics of this theory say there is just no parallel for that in all of medical history. Okay, so on to our third and final alternative. What if it wasn't a lie and it wasn't a hallucination? What if it was just a legend? Like a story that starts small and then gets bigger and more elaborate with each retelling, growing over decades until it becomes this grand supernatural myth? The big problem with the legend theory is timing, or really the lack of it. Legends need time to cook. They usually take generations to develop. But when you look at this timeline, historians date the core belief in the resurrection to just a few years after the crucifixion. That belief didn't just bubble up decades later. It seems to have exploded almost immediately. And that's really, really fast for a legend to form. So let's just take a step back and see where this investigation has taken us. According to the argument we're examining, each one of the standard natural explanations for what the disciples claimed, well, it runs into its own significant roadblock. So let's just recap really quick. The lie theory struggles with motive.
Why die for something you know is fake? The hallucination theory struggles with group appearances, and the legend theory struggles with the timeline. The belief just seems to pop up way too early.
And this whole process of elimination brings us right back to our starting point. If the most common alternative explanations all have these serious problems, then what are we left with? This slide really just captures the logical funnel of the argument. If you accept that Jesus died, and you find it implausible that the disciples were lying, and the hallucination theory doesn't really fit the group claims, and the legend theory doesn't fit the timeline, then you're left with a really profound puzzle. And this is exactly why our source material calls it a fascinating historical mystery. The argument is that you have this historical event, but there's no easy, natural explanation that seems to fit all the facts that we have. So, ultimately, after laying out the core facts and walking through the competing theories, the question gets passed on to you. Having looked at the evidence we've presented, which explanation do you think makes the most sense? The lie, the hallucination, the legend, or the original claim itself? The mystery, it seems, endures.